Excited to welcome Heidi Gazelle from the Department of Human Development and Family Science here in the college. She's going to be talking today about child vulnerability and interpersonal stress impact development in school environments. Um, just to get things started, I'll say a little bit about her and then give her the floor. So, Dr. Gazelle she's an associate professor in human development and family science. She's the director of the social development lab. And in that department, she received her bachelor's from Wesleyan and her PhD in developmental and socialization processes from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She did postdoctoral work at the Center for Developmental Science at UNC Chapel Hill and Duke. Her work has been funded by the National Institute of Mental Health and the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. She's the author of dozens of scientific papers, peer-reviewed papers on her areas of expertise. We're lucky to have her as a speaker in our Colloquium series, especially because her work is, while oriented towards developmental psychology, is very much relevant to a variety of different issues in the educational context as well. So the way that this is going to proceed is if you have a clarifying question that you'd like to ask during the talk, feel free to raise your hand, or if you want to put something in the chat. Um, uh, uh, Dr. Dennis and I will be monitoring that. Otherwise, you can save your questions till the end, where we'll have considerable time to ask questions and have discussion before finishing up at 2 o'clock. So with all that being said, unless I've missed something, Dr. Dennis, Dr. Gazelle, please, it's all yours.
Okay. Well, very nice to meet all of you, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to share my work with you today. I'm going to start by talking about the overarching developmental science perspective that shares my work, and then I'll give you some highlights from my research program. First, I'll talk about the child vulnerability or diathesis by environmental stress model that guides my work. And then I'll give you some highlights from my longitudinal project, Multiple Trajectories in Anxious Solitary Youth. So first I'll show you some findings about how the annual school rhythm impacts children's peer relations at school. And then we'll talk about how the middle school transition can be a turning point for some children in terms of their peer relations and their mental health. And we'll look at multiple trajectories that children demonstrate in their in both elementary school and in middle school. So my work is guided by an overarching developmental science perspective. According to that perspective, human development arises from the continuous interplay of multi-level phenomena over time in the child environment system. And so when I talk about multiple levels of phenomena, I'm referring to everything from internal levels like genetic influences to broad external levels like culture and changes that happen over historical time. Now, my work focuses on child behavior and affect, and how child affective behavioral vulnerabilities interact with interpersonal partners, okay? And so I look at children's peers, their friends, their parents, and their teachers. In the work that I'm going to share with you today, I'm going to focus on interactions with peers that happen mainly at school, okay? And so the school environment figures very prominently in my work, okay? And also a sort of principle that is part of this developmental science perspective is that oftentimes looking at the interaction between levels of influence, like the child and their interpersonal environment, really leads to increased understanding and innovation, as well as transactions, so complex influences that happen between children and their social partners over time. Okay. All right. So why study anxious solitary children? Well, humans are social animals. We live in social groups. So the ability to interact adaptively with group members is really critical to healthy individual development. Anxious solitary children often struggle to establish adaptive interactions with others. And so anxious solitary children seldom participate in peer social interaction when we compare them to their age mates. So they often miss out on critical social learning experiences. Also, some have negative interpersonal interactions with peers and parents. We'll talk in particular about peer exclusion today. And so those experiences can be maladaptive social learning processes. So studying anxious solitary children illuminates key interpersonal learning processes in social and emotional development, and these are also relevant for children's mental health. So I'm going to talk about two key constructs throughout the highlights I'm going to share with you today. Anxious solitude locates the impetus for children's solitary behavior in social contexts in the child, whereas peer exclusion locates the impetus for solitude externally in the interpersonal environment. Okay. So anxious solitude is an effective behavioral profile that children exhibit among their familiar classmates. Okay. We can observe anxious solitude when it's manifested in solitary onlooking and unoccupied behavior. If we look at the photograph up here, I don't know if you can see my cursor, the photograph on the upper left-hand corner, we see the child observing their peers at play. So I would code that if I was doing behavioral observation as solitary onlooking behavior. Okay. And we conceptualize anxious solitary behavior as a social approach avoidance motivation conflict. So in other words, children want to interact with their peers, but they're held back by social anxiety. So this solitary onlooking behavior, when a child exhibits it at high rates, we view that as a manifestation of this approach avoidance conflict. Okay. Also, other behaviors that are indicative of anxious solitude include verbal reticence and also unoccupied solitary behavior. Okay. Now, peer exclusion, on the other hand, refers to peers leaving a child out of their activities, both indirectly, like simply not approaching a child, but also directly, like a child might be told, no, you can't sit here. Okay. So if you look at both photographs I have here, from that snapshot in time, it's a little hard to tell what's going on. We may be looking at both anxious solitude and peer exclusion at the same time. And we'll see in my research that the two are not synonymous, okay? Anxious solitude, in order to identify that, we have to look at what the child is doing. In order to identify peer exclusion, we have to look at how the peers are treating the child. But they do often co-occur. And we'll see that in the research that I'm going to share with you today. So in my early work, I established that anxious solitary children who are excluded by their peers versus their non-excluded counterparts demonstrate more stability or increase in their anxious solitude over time. They also demonstrate more social helplessness in response to a setback, and they report more depressive symptoms over time as well. So this combination of anxious solitude and peer exclusion has really important implications for children's adjustment over time and has long-term consequences. Now, I conceptualize these effects using a vulnerability or diathesis stress model. Okay, so according to this model, some children enter school with a kind of vulnerability to social anxiety or anxious solitude. Okay, now this in and of itself is typically not sufficient to lead those children to develop depressive symptoms. But if they encounter peer exclusion, essentially they're encountering the confirmation of their fears. And we found that that sort of confirmation of their peers tends to lead children from that kind of social helpless orientation linked with anxiety to develop a sense of hopelessness, okay, that's more characteristic of depression. So this kind of stressor of peer exclusion really provides children with a very negative social learning experience where their fears are confirmed, and then those fears really translate into other issues as well, such as depressive hopelessness. So this is what I refer to as a diathesis or vulnerability stress process, and we'll see other examples of this in findings that I'm going to share with you today. So I'm going to show you a couple of findings from my longitudinal multiple trajectories in anxious solitary youth data set, which has been funded both by the NIMH and currently by the NICHD. We're actually currently doing a young adult follow-up of the sample. So the overall aims of this research program were to describe and explain continuity and change in anxious solitude and peer exclusion trajectories from middle childhood through early adolescence. And again, now we're also looking at these children in young adulthood, these original children in our sample. So we look at both child factors and processes as well as environmental factors and processes, and particularly the school environment. Okay, so the original project was a 5-year longitudinal study that followed children prospectively from 3rd through 7th grade. So that includes the transition to middle school and 6th grade. And assessments occurred 1 to 2 times a year. So we assessed some things 10 times over that 5-year period. Assessments were multi-informant, multi-method, and multi-level. Okay, so most of the results I'm going to share with you today come from the screening sample of the study, which was 688 children that were drawn from 46 third grade classrooms in 7 U.S. public elementary schools. The sample was approximately evenly divided between boys and girls, and it was relatively diverse in terms of race and ethnicity. Okay. Now, there's also a selected sample of 230 children from that 688, which participated in more in-depth measures. So when I share with you reports on children's self-reported mental health, that will come from the selected smaller sample of 230. That sample was 57% girls. And half of that sample was selected as being 1 standard deviation or above for peer-reported anxious solitude, and the other half was demographically matched controls that were anywhere across the spectrum in terms of anxious solitude except below the cutoff. Okay, so we have basically over-selected anxious solitary children, and then comparison children across the rest of the spectrum of anxious solitude. Okay, and again, that's just that selected sample, which will apply only to our results on self-reported psychopathology symptoms, but the rest that I'll show you is that screening sample of 688. Okay, so we use peer nominations to identify most of our key constructs. So these nominations are coming from children's classmates when we're talking about elementary school, and when we're looking at middle school, we actually use nominations from students on the young adolescents middle school team. Okay, so that's usually students that the child shares classes with, even though they go to multiple different classes. So we assessed anxious solitude by peer nominations for shy, nervous, afraid, watches other kids playing but doesn't join in, doesn't have much to say. For externalizing behavior, starts fights, spread rumors, acts wild. For peer exclusion, this child gets left out, gets told they can't play. For peer victimization, gets teased, hit, kicked, and pushed. And we also had a nomination for can't defend oneself, doesn't know how to defend themselves when kids pick on them. So essentially, children were selecting names of children who fit those descriptions. And our scores indicate that a lot of a child's classmates identified them as fitting those descriptions, okay? All of these items showed adequate internal reliability and stability over time. Okay, so the analyses I'm going to show you are growth curve analyses that were conducted in HLM, hierarchical linear modeling. This technique is well adapted to analysis of continuity and change in repeated measures data. And these analyses predict deviations from the mean trajectory over time. So we're looking at children who tended to show trajectories that deviate from the average trajectory in the sample. And this yields trajectories for prototypical children with certain predictor levels. Okay. All right. So to begin with, we are looking at whether the ecological context of school contributes to the waxing and waning of peer relations over time. We're going to look both at annual school rhythms first, and then we'll look at the middle school transition as a major potential perturbation in those developmental trajectories. So first of all, this is the annual rhythm. So what we have here is the first three, or actually the last three grades of elementary school, third, fourth, and fifth grade. So this is a model in which we were looking at the fall to spring rhythms through a technique called cross-classification and growth curves. And so what we see here is that within each grade of elementary school, that there was a bit of an increase in peer exclusion from the fall to the spring. As children remained in the same classroom, we saw growth in peer exclusion somewhat over time in each of those three grades. We also see a decline in levels of peer exclusion overall through these last 3 years of elementary school. Okay. So why do we see that pattern of growth in peer exclusion from fall to spring? We think that the reshuffling of children into classrooms at the beginning of each school year prompts reduced peer exclusion, because at the outset of the school year, most children are interested in making new friends and joining new peer groups, okay? But as membership in peer groups solidifies, peer exclusion grows across the school year, okay? So we see that pattern within each school year for those last 3 years of elementary school. But we were also interested in looking at the middle school transition as a period in which we might see more stronger changes in children's peer exclusion. So here we're looking at the same sample, and now we're looking at them for those same 3 last years of elementary school, but also the first 2 years of middle school. So we're looking at their development across the transition to middle school. Now, you no longer see the fall to spring pattern. It's still there, but this more complex model didn't allow us to illustrate that, use that cross classification. So you don't see it, but it's still there. What you see most prominently in this model is that there's a dramatic drop in peer exclusion just after the transition to middle school in the fall of 6th grade, okay? And we also see a somewhat different level of peer exclusion for boys and girls, okay? Particularly after the transition of middle school, boys are showing somewhat higher levels of peer exclusion, okay? So why do we think this dramatic drop happens after the transition to middle school? Well, we think that the collective renegotiation of peer relations that takes place after a major school transition creates an opportunity for a fresh start, okay? So we see major school transitions as a time period in which the child environment system encounters externally prompted self-reorganization, in which there's a heightened potential for change. Okay. So again, I come back to that same idea that when children start a new school year, and especially if they're making a major school transition, starting middle school, they're interested in making new friends and joining new peer groups. And that effect is stronger in a major school transition, even though we see it modestly when we look from fall to spring within each school year. Okay, so the effect becomes stronger with the school transition. And so therefore, there is the opportunity for a fresh start for some children to change their peer relations more strongly than they typically would from year to year without a transition. Okay, so this also means that school transitions may be particularly opportune periods for intervention, okay, because there is this heightened potential for change. Okay, now you also would recall that part of the patterns that we saw in peer exclusion we saw effects that were somewhat different for boys and girls, okay? So particularly after the middle school transition, we saw that anxious solitary boys tended to have higher levels of peer exclusion than other boys, okay? So why might that be the case? Well, anxious solitude is likely a greater violation of male gender norms, okay? So it tends to be seen as somewhat more acceptable for girls to be anxious, but that tends to run counter to for norms that emphasize self-assertion for males, okay? So we think that that's what's going on with those gender differences, okay? I also wanted to say a little bit more about the translational significance of these findings. So when we think about the implications of these findings for intervention, first of all, if we're asking who should be targeted as most in need for intervention, I would argue that anxious solitary children who are experiencing peer difficulties should be targeted for intervention, okay? And if we're asking, what should interventions target, I would also argue that anxiety arises from the interaction of the child and their interpersonal environment, and thus comprehensive interventions should address both the child and their school environment, okay? And we have more interventions that target anxious children than we do interventions that target environments, and particularly the propensity for people and environments to exclude members of that environment, okay? Although I can, in the end, if you're interested, I can tell you about at least one intervention that's been developed to address peer exclusion in schools, okay? And of course, we can also ask, when should interventions take place? So the rhythms of peer relationship formation that are linked with the school year can actually be harnessed to facilitate change in interventions. I think it's actually very important to know about these rhythms because they could enhance the efficacy of intervention. Okay, now I'm also going to show you some more findings. So we also asked whether there are distinct pathways of anxious solitude that are identified in elementary and middle school, and whether the middle school transition could be a turning point in those pathways for some youth, and what factors and processes predict certain pathways, and finally, what mental health outcomes are linked with different pathways. Okay. So here we're using a technique called latent class growth analyses. So we identified classes of children who demonstrated similar anxious solitary trajectories over time. And given our interest in the middle school transition as a turning point, we calculated separate latent class growth analyses for elementary school and for middle school. And results indicated a 2-class solution was optimal for elementary school, and a 3-class solution was optimal for middle school. Okay, so this is what the elementary school trajectories look like. We found that there was a high increasing class of children who started out relatively high in anxious solitude and increased over time. That was about 20% of our sample of 688 children. And then there was a moderate decreasing sample, which was 80% of those children. Okay. When we look in middle school, we found that the most common pattern was low stable. So 59% of the children are in this class. And then there was also a low increasing class. 34% of the children were in this class. And finally, a high decreasing class, which characterized the trajectories of about 7% of the children. Okay, now you're probably wondering about the connection between those two trajectory classes. Okay, so we did a chi-square analysis to look at whether there were significant patterns of relation between the elementary and the middle school classes, and there certainly were. So for children who were in the moderate decreasing class here, okay, 68% of them, which is a significant pattern of relation, ended up in the low stable class. So most of the children who were in this moderate decreasing class then were in the low stable class in middle school. Now, of those 20% of children who were in the high increasing class, there was a significant pattern for them to end up in both the low increasing class. So 57% of them, so most of them did show that low increasing pattern in middle school. But there were also 16% of those children who started out in this moderate decreasing class who ended up in the high decreasing class in middle school. Okay, so that too was a significant pattern. Okay, so consistent with a developmental science perspective, the middle school transition can be a turning point for children, but it can be a turning point for better or for worse. Okay, so what predicts high and increasing versus decreasing and low stable anxious solitude trajectories in elementary and middle school? Okay, so we did logistic regression to look at predictors of membership in these different classes. And overall, what we found is that the high and the increasing classes were predicted by elevated peer exclusion and in it being perceived by one's peers as unable to defend oneself. Also, children were less likely to be in the high and increasing groups if they displayed externalizing behavior. Now, what I actually find most fascinating about these predictors is what differentiated children who ended up in the low increasing middle school class versus the high decreasing middle school class, okay? And again, this is patterns of anxious solitude. So although peer exclusion predicted membership in both those groups, when we looked at the pattern of peer exclusion within middle school, we found that those who were in the low increasing class experienced increasing peer exclusion over time in middle school, whereas those young adolescents who were in the high decreasing class experienced decreasing peer exclusion over time in middle school. Also, those children who were in the low increasing class were viewed as unable to defend themselves by their peers in both elementary school and middle school, whereas those who ended up in the high decreasing class were viewed as unable to defend themselves in elementary school, but not in middle school. So these children had been able to take advantage of the fresh start they had in middle school to change something about how they were relating to their peers, and they were perceived as better able to defend themselves in middle school, okay? And they were becoming less excluded in middle school. And corresponding to that, they showed a trajectory of decreasing anxious solitude in middle school. Now, we also wanted to know about these children's internalizing problems. Okay, so we examined social anxiety symptoms on the social phobia and anxiety inventory for children, and also depressive symptoms on the children's depression inventory. Okay, so these are self-reported symptoms. So now we're talking about the smaller sample of about 230, in this case, young adolescents. So here, through a regression analyses, when we looked at these anxiety and depression symptoms in elementary school, we found only main effects, okay? So we did find that children in the high increasing versus moderate decreasing class did report higher symptoms of social anxiety. That was actually true in both elementary and middle school. Peer exclusion also predicted higher depressive symptoms as expected, and that was also true in both elementary and middle school. Now, so those were main effects, but we also found evidence for diathesis stress processes in middle school. So there, children who were in the low increasing group compared to those who were in the low stable group, we found actually a three-way interaction for them that involved that membership as well as peer exclusion and female biological sex, okay? So girls who were in the low increasing rather than low and stable class and who were experiencing peer exclusion in middle school reported heightened social anxiety and depressive symptoms, okay? So it was girls in particular, anxious solitary girls who were experiencing exclusion that were really reporting those high levels of social anxiety and depression, okay? For the high decreasing class, we did not find differences in their internalizing problems. Okay, so taken together, results support peer exclusion as a key stressor in vulnerability or diathesis stress processes. And these results go beyond some of my previous studies by suggesting that even when diathesis stress processes occur, vulnerable children can improve through effective responses to interpersonal stress, okay, especially in the context of a fresh start. So taken together, child anxious solitary tendencies interact with school and family environments to produce differential chances for healthy interpersonal interactions, adaptive development, and mental health. These dynamic multi-level interactions occur throughout childhood and adolescence, presenting continuing opportunities for individual continuity and change. Opportunity for change is particularly heightened during school transition periods. Thus, school transition periods are particularly opportune times for prevention and growth in effective responses to stress. Okay. And I'd also just like to acknowledge the support of the National Institutes of Health, as well as members of the Social Development Lab, past and present. My current lab members are pictured here, as well as the children, families, and schools that have participated in this research. And I would be happy to respond to your questions.
Thanks so much for that, Dr. Gazelle. That was just a bunch of really large and rich data to report on, and really wonderful talk. We appreciate it. So right now we have a bit of time to have the group, especially students, ask questions and engage in dialogue about the talk. And a reminder that part of the purpose of these colloquia are for graduate students to have the opportunity to talk about the research that's presented. So we really encourage you to ask questions. And so at this point, we'll put it out to the group and see what members of the audience have to ask.
Hello there.
Hello.
I would be interested in knowing more about that environmental intervention that you were talking about when you were mentioning the translational work.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to tell you about that. So there is a book that you might have heard of called You Can't Say You Can't Play. It was written by Vivian Paley, who was a kindergarten teacher at the Chicago Lab School. A lot of teachers know about this book. Now, it's not a empirically evaluated intervention, but essentially this is a book that kind of presents a sort of, you might think of it as a case study of Vivian Paley's conversations with students about whether it's okay to exclude other people. She links it to sort of some American values of, children say things like, well, I can choose who I want to play with. She asked them things like, well, if everyone has to be at school, is it okay for some people to have to be there, but not to be able to participate? And she gets them to think about things like that. She talks with children of a variety of ages. A lot of the students thought that you might be able to sort of successfully implement a rule like you can't say you can't play with kindergarten students, but that it would be increasingly hard as children got older. But she does try to implement that rule and has some success with it. And most children can identify with sort of hurtful feelings of being excluded. So that's something a lot of teachers are exposed to, and some teachers, try that rule in their classroom. And then my colleague, Amanda Harris. So Amanda Harris is at the Department of Human Development and Family Science at Oklahoma State University. She actually tried this intervention to sort of empirically evaluate it. And she did find some efficacy in that intervention. So I'd encourage you, if you're interested in looking at how it might be implemented and, whether there's really, what the evidence looks like to support that, look at Amanda Harris's intervention. To my knowledge, that's the only sort of empirical evaluation of that to date. But I really like Vivian Paley's book in part because it highlights how ideas about including and excluding others are somewhat culturally based, and but also how classroom communities can actually discuss that and make decisions about whether they want to create a sort of inclusive community. So it's also possible to address. I see that there's a question in the chat too, so maybe I should take a look at this. And Rebecca, does that answer your question?
Yes, absolutely. And it was actually Dr. Dennis putting the Amazon link to the book, which I had not seen before. So thank you for sending that.
Oh, you're welcome. Okay.
Another question? Anyone have a question?
I could ask another question.
Go for it, Becca.
So it's like back to your measurement. At first, when you were talking, I was wondering about how you found the children that were exhibiting this symptomology. And then I thought it was really interesting that you're using like the peer report. And I was wondering if maybe if other people had tried like teacher report, or if this peer report was like what has been found to be most reliable to identify these kids.
Yeah, that's a great question. A great methodological question, Rebecca. I mentioned at the outset that this longitudinal study had multiple informants. Okay, so we actually assessed anxious solitude with 5 different informants and methods. So we gathered peer reports. We did ask teachers and parents. We asked children to self-report anxious solitude, and we also observed anxious solitude at recess time. So we did this a lot of different ways. We use peer reports as our main way of identifying anxious solitary children for multiple reasons. I actually have a paper which is a multi-trait, multi-method analysis. So where we looked at all of those 5 informants, and we were looking at anxious solitude, peer exclusion, and also unsociability. And that multi-trait, multi-method analysis did indicate that peer reporters stood out as the strongest, both in terms of convergent and divergent validity. So in other words, there was agreement among informants, okay, but also peer reports were best at distinguishing anxious solitude from peer exclusion and from unsociability. Okay, so that's one reason why we use the peers. More conceptually, we see peers as sort of inside reporters, so inside participants in children's peer interactions. So given that what we're interested in is understanding peer interactions, we think that peers understand those interactions in a way that adults don't always. So that they're sort of, that inside perspective is particularly valuable when we're assessing, peer interactions. Also, when we're gathering peer reports, we're gathering those reports obviously from multiple children. So, you might see a typical classroom of, 20 some children. We're getting multiple reports. So that also means that peer reports typically do not suffer from single rater biases. Like sometimes teacher or parent reports can be quite idiosyncratic. There are trade-offs between different reporters, but for a number of reasons, peers have a good number of strengths. Also, because of our design where we were screening children and then doing more in-depth assessment with a smaller number, we were able to do the peer nominations pretty efficiently with large numbers. So there were a lot of reasons that we use the peer reports as our primary, but in various different papers, we use other informants too. And there is, as I mentioned, agreement amongst informants, a good deal of agreement about anxious solitary behaviors. Yeah, but good question.
The convergent and divergent validity piece is super cool for the peers.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. And I should also add, though, that every one of those informants makes a unique contribution. So they all were valid informants of anxious solitude, of anxious solitary behavior. I think I saw, oh yes, CJ, that you were going to ask a question earlier. I'm afraid I can't hear, though.
We can't hear you for some reason, CJ. I see that you're not muted, though.
Yeah.
No. No. But if you can't get it going and you want to type a question in the chat, we can read it, or if you want to restart or something, we can give you a minute.
Can you hear me now or no?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
I got 2 screens going on and I always get confused with them.
Nice.
Okay. Hi there. I
Hi.
was wondering about the analysis that you use there. You mentioned a type of growth curve that I hadn't heard about before, and I was wondering if you could speak more to that process.
Okay. Were you thinking of one of the growth curves in particular?
It was the first graph you showed from the, I would have to see it.
Using HLM, was it that one?
I think I know which one you're talking about. That one?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so there in order to capture this pattern of growth from fall to spring across each of these academic years, my collaborator, Richard Fedowski, used something called cross-classification. So in growth curves, you typically code time, like the most typical way we might code time is, because our study began in 3rd grade, that might be 0, and then each time point would be, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. Okay. So with cross classification, we're adding in another sort of element of time, which is, you might think of it as season or semester, right? So in addition to that, like linear characterization of time, we added in the fall spring code. Okay, so that might have been like a 0, 1, and so that would repeat so that we could capture the fall to spring effects. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And in this instance, we did find that there was a fall to spring effect where there was this increase in peer exclusion over time. So it's basically a way of characterizing your data in growth curves where you're able to say, not only do we have repeated measures over time, but there's a structure to this time, right? There's a fall to spring pattern. And essentially it's another predictor. So you can enter that in and you might find, oh, there's no fall to spring effect. Okay. But in this case, we entered that in and we found that there was growth.
Mm-hmm.
And that was, important because it's really, again, gets at this idea that there's an increase in peer exclusion as a social group exists over time, as they continue over time, that it's over time we see the growth of peer exclusion with the solidification of group membership, in particular peer groups.
Very cool. Thank you so much for explaining that.
You're very welcome.
And I have an additional question if no one else does. Does your research look at the transition from middle school to high school? Have you examined that, or are you familiar with that research as well? Because I feel like, just in my own experience, like that's a bigger shift sometimes for students.
Yeah, I wish that we could have done that. We did not look at the transition to middle school. So we are currently in touch with the sample and looking at their adjustment in young adulthood, but unfortunately we weren't able to look at that transition to high school. I mean, I would say in general that I would expect a similar phenomena in terms of a fresh start. I think that when you have a major school transition, you should normally see those stronger sort of fresh start dynamics. I mean, there are things that make the middle school transition unique, though. I'm aware of more research on the middle school transition than I am about the transition to high school.
Mm-hmm.
And normally that transition is characterized as a particularly stressful time for young adolescents. We think of like Jackie Eccles' work in particular. So until I did this work, people mainly thought of the middle school transition as a real time of risk. And it's not that we don't find that that's the case in some respects, but people really had not thought about the middle school transition as this potentially positive opportunity for some children, where they can have a fresh start with peer relations. And I mean, if you really look at the numbers in my data, like if we go down, let's see if I can go down again to that chart. So the most common pattern we're seeing is for those children who showed the high increasing trajectory in elementary school, most of them are, experiencing improvement, less peer exclusion initially. But we know that these children, so they also showed improvement in anxious solitude initially, but that gradually over time, they tended to increase somewhat in their anxious solitude. And we know that they were also experiencing increased peer exclusion too. So for most children, we're seeing kind of a repeat of similar patterns. But but that's not true of all children. We were able to find this group that actually showed this significant decline. So they're not the majority of anxious solitary children, but I think that's a really fascinating group. You know, it was 33 children who displayed that pattern where they seemed to really turn things around and showed this decline in anxious solitude and peer exclusion, and they were better able to defend themselves, and they did not report significant mental health symptoms, you know, either social anxiety or depression. So they really seem to have this interrelated improvement socially and in terms of their behavior and their mental health, and really did better in middle school. So I think it's important to keep in mind that for some children, it actually can be a very positive turning point. It's not the most common pattern we see. It is more common for children to kind of have some improvement, but for many of those patterns to sort of repeat themselves, unfortunately. But I think it's really important to know about what's possible. And we see children who demonstrate very different patterns across that transition.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Next question. Says that question.
I have a question of curiosity. As you were examining these self-reports from the students, did you ever come across any cases that you felt needed to be addressed immediately because of their high levels of anxious solitude, or any other indicators that they may need help immediately?
Well, one thing I should mention is that in terms of the depression inventory we used, we removed the items about suicidality. So we made sure that we couldn't miss anything that was urgent. But this study was not an intervention study. It has a lot of implications for intervention, as I talked about, but we were not at all intending to intervene. This was really geared at understanding the natural development of anxious solitude as it occurs in children's real environments, and not to intervene in that. Now, if parents reached out to us for referrals, we would provide them, but by and large, that was very rare. So this is what development really looks like in the community. There are certainly, children out there who have these anxious tendencies. Some of them develop, you can see that not all of them develop clinical, symptoms of clinical anxiety and depression, but some do. And that's realistically what patterns look like in the community. So yes, we didn't intervene unless we were asked for a referral.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Heidi, I had a question. Do you have any information on your participants, whether or not any of the individuals had disabilities, either in the reporting group or the ones that you were collecting data on, the anxious solitary group?
We had an instrument that screened for autism spectrum disorders, and we've since used that screener in some of our other work as well. So we did get reports of a small number that did receive autism spectrum diagnosis. It was very small though, so it was not wouldn't account for the patterns that we're seeing. It was just a couple students. So by and large, we didn't have high numbers here, but that certainly can be a reason to, that can so autism spectrum disorders can manifest in ways that a child might show up as anxious solitary, but probably for different reasons. Yeah.
Other questions from the group? I'll ask, and somewhat of a follow-on from what CJ asked about transition across years, and I love the fresh start construct. I think a lot of us can relate to that construct even socially. It makes it very accessible for interpretation. But it made me think about the fact that those transitions have all sorts of interesting, there's probably interesting sociocultural variation. And what I'm particularly thinking of is in urban versus rural environments. So I could imagine that the opportunities for fresh start in schooling environments in rural locales, for example, are more limited than they are in urban locales because of the size of the school and the community from which schools draw from. But that's only one example. I think there are a number of others. And I understand you didn't study that in this research, but do you have any thoughts about that and the extent to which the sort of the fresh start opportunity varies as a function of these kind of predictable aspects of society and culture, and especially in the American context, but I'm sure it's applicable outside of the US as well.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, anecdotally, so this research was done in North Carolina. I was at University of North Carolina at Greensboro at the time, and so the communities were it was basically High Point, Kernersville, North Carolina, High Point, Carolina, and part of Winston-Salem, North Carolina. So these are kind of moderate sized communities. They're kind of in between urban and rural. Okay, we're certainly not talking about big metropolitan areas at all. Although I would say that, it's quite different than a really isolated rural context. Anecdotally, when I was in graduate school working with children in very small communities in Illinois, so Urbana-Champaign, Illinois is kind of in the cornfield. So sometimes we would go out to other smaller communities, and we did tend to find more of the phenomena that kids would kind of be friends with everyone at the school in those really small communities. So I do think that context is important, but I do think that phenomena of a fresh start when you start in a new context in a new school is quite a robust phenomena, and I would expect to find that in general, even after the high school transition. I think it's quite a robust phenomenon that, sure, there can be more, there can be variations on that in different types of communities. When I published some of this work, actually, I was asked kind of a different variation on that same question about whether it would apply to other cultures. And I argued that it would. There are differences in the importance that children and adolescents place on peer relationships that are cultural, but I still think that this fresh start phenomena is quite robust.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
We have just a minute left. Are there any final questions before we adjourn today? It looks like not. Dr. Gazelle, thanks so much for being a part of this. The talk was incredible, and we appreciate you taking the time to do this with us. And we'll be sharing the video of the talk using our usual channels, and we appreciate your time.
You're very welcome. And it was a pleasure to meet all of you.
Thank you, Heidi.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.